Okay, now we're going to take a look at the second part. This is podcast number 2 for Standard 2.1a, which is all about the cell parts. So continuing on with our major functions of the cell parts, some cell parts need to be able to store materials. So the main storage component for the cell is a vacuole. This is a sac of fluid that's surrounded by a membrane, and it is used to store things like food, different fluids, water with stuff dissolved in it, and various waste products until the cell can get rid of those things. In plant cells, the vacuole is very large compared to animal cells, and that is because they need to be able to store large amounts of water in order to do photosynthesis. Also used for storage are lysosomes. Lysosomes are little sacs that are made of membranes, and they contain digestive enzymes inside of them. They are able to fuse with vacuoles, and they can digest food. They can also digest worn out cell parts. And they may even be able to get rid of bacteria or waste products and things that come into the cell that the cell doesn't want anymore. They are also known as suicide sacs. So if a cell gets sick or is starting to get old, these can actually break open and they will destroy the entire cell from the inside out. So it's kind of a defensive mechanism for the cell. All right, now we also have our cell parts that are going to be acting as our energy transformers. So they're going to take energy and change it into different forms. All cells have mitochondria. Mitochondria are going to produce energy for the cell doing a process called cellular respiration. They are also known as the power plant or the powerhouse of the cell because basically they're going to take energy that is stored in glucose, in our sugars, and they're going to convert it into a form of energy called ATP. And that ATP is what we're going to use in our cells. It's a very usable form of energy. So we will go over cellular respiration in a lot more detail later on in the year. These guys have a kind of a unique shape to them. They have an outer membrane, and then on the inside they have a highly folded inner membrane that goes in and out, and it actually gives for lots of area for cellular respiration to happen, and that's why they have this unique structure to them. Something else that is interesting about mitochondria is they actually have their own source of DNA, so they have their own DNA inside of them. And that DNA can actually be used to trace maternal family heritage. So you can actually trace your mother's family line going back pretty far by looking at the DNA that is inside of the mitochondria. The reason for that is because you receive all of your mitochondria from your mom's egg. The only thing that you get from your dad is his DNA, but all of your cell parts were also your mom's cell parts. So whatever DNA was in hers is the same DNA that you have in yours. The other energy transformer that cells can use is the chloroplast. All cells have these except for simple prokaryotes and animal cells. Fungi do not have chloroplast either. So you will find chloroplast in plant cells and in some of the protists. And the reason for that is they are going to transform light energy into chemical energy. These are the ones that are going to do photosynthesis. So the process of photosynthesis only occurs in plants and protists. And there we're going to take light energy and we're going to form it into food molecules, mainly glucose. And then we eat that glucose and we break it down doing cellular respiration in our mitochondria. Now, plants and protists also have mitochondria because the food that they make through photosynthesis, they are going to need to be able to break down using the mitochondria. Chloroplasts contain a pigment called chlorophyll, which is green. So that green pigment is what's going to be used to trap energy, and that's also what gives plants their green color. But the actual function of a chloroplast is to do photosynthesis. It is not to make the plants green. That's just kind of what happens because of the pigment that's there. All right, we have organelles that are going to provide support for the cell. We talked about the cell wall already, which goes around the outside of the cell, but cells that don't have a cell wall have an actual internal skeleton. That is called the cytoskeleton. It's the skeleton of the cell. And basically it's a network of fibers that crisscross all throughout inside of the cell, and they provide a scaffolding for the cell and support for the organelles. That cytoskeleton is made of little filaments, protein filaments called microtubules, and then even solid, thinner ones called microfilaments. So you have microtubules and microfilaments, and they're crisscrossing all throughout this inside of the cell, which gives it support and allows it to kind of stay almost what looks like inflated, like a balloon. And it's because of these in here. And also they're going to allow organelles to move around inside. So this is what your cytoskeleton might look like. So here you have your cell membrane on either side, and you will have these different microtubules and microfilaments all inside, and you can see they're attached to the different organelles, and they're kind of supporting it and keeping it giving it the structure that it needs. All right, now some cells need to be able to move, or they need to be able to move stuff past them. So that's called locomotion. Some cells have cilia on them. Cilia are very short, numerous hair-like projections that come off of the plasma membrane. So they look like these little kind of hairy monsters coming off here. And they move in a coordinated beating fashion. So they actually will flow back and forth, back and forth. And as they do that, they can move materials back with them. They also can allow things to, certain kinds of organisms to move around using that beating motion that they have. Other cells have longer tails on them. These are called flagella. These are longer projections that come off the plasma membrane, so you have a big long tail that comes off the end of the back of the cell. Sometimes there's only one, sometimes there's three. They move with a whip-like action, so they actually kind of like spin around, and that propels the cell forward. Probably the one that you're most familiar with are sperm cells, have a long flagellum on them that allows them to swim all the way up to the egg. Okay. We also have some cell parts that are going to be involved with cell division. These are called centrioles. They are made up of protein, and they're going to play a role in the splitting of a cell into two cells. This process is called mitosis. Again, this is another unit that we will do this year. And in the splitting of cells, we're going to make identical copies of the cells. You need to have certain structures that are made to help this. And so the centrioles are going to make these special structures that are going to allow these cells to separate. Those structures are called spindle fibers. So centrioles are found in animal and fungal cells. Plant cells have something similar. It's called a centrosome, but it kind of does the same thing. All right, so one of the things that we need to be able to do when we talk about cells is compare plant and animal cells. There's major differences between them. Plant cells contain chloroplasts, which animal cells do not have. Plant cells have a cell wall. Animal cells do not have a cell wall. And plant cells also have a very large central vacuole, because remember we talked about how they need to be able to store a lot of water in order to do all their photosynthesis. So animal cells have no chloroplasts, no cell walls. Their vacuoles, if they have them, are very small. And animal cells contain centrioles that are used for cell division, where plant cells do not have centrioles. Okay, so this diagram is kind of showing you the difference between them. So these ones that are in pink are the ones that are the major differences. So you have the cell wall going around the plant cell, you have the centriole over here in the animal cell, here's the chloroplast, and finally they both have the vacuole, but you can see the plant cell's vacuole is very, very big, takes up all this space, it's even bigger than the nucleus, whereas the animal cell one will have a few of them, but they're much, much smaller. Everything else between them is the same. So the last thing we're going to do is we're going to label the parts of this particular cell. So the nucleolus is right here in the middle. And remember, the nucleolus is going to be responsible for making proteins. And then as we move around the cell, you can see up here, this is a flagellum. So here's these long tail-like projections that come off the cell membrane, so that this cell could use that to swim around if it needed to. So that would be a flagellum. Down here we have a mitochondrion. Mitochondria are used to do cellular respiration to get energy for the cell. So mitochondrion is one. If the word ends in A, we're actually talking about more than one. So that's a distinction between those words. Next up we have a structure that's going to be used for transporting molecules to the cell membrane. That's the Golgi apparatus. Golgi apparatus is going to refine, modify our proteins, put the finishing touches on them, and then send them over to the cell membrane to get transported out. Next down here are those little cell parts that are going to be used for cell division. So they'll actually make fibers that come out of them called spindle fibers that will move the chromosomes around. So those are our centrioles. Here we have our little hair-like projections that come off of some cells, not all cells. These are the cilia. And again, those can be used for movement or for moving things past, so those are the ones that will move back and forth in that coordinated fashion. Next one up here is looking at these little lines that are found throughout the cell in the cytoplasm. That is your cytoskeleton. So again, that's going to give support and structure to the cell because this is an animal cell, not a plant cell, so there's no cell wall, so it's got to have a cytoskeleton. Next up is pointing at this entire structure here. This is endoplasmic reticulum. This one is that you're looking at here is the rough endoplasmic reticulum because it has ribosomes attached to it. Over here, which is not labeled, is the smooth. That's the smooth ER. That's the one that's going to be responsible for making your lipids. Okay, and the difference between them, you can see the smooth does not have ribosomes attached, whereas the rough does. So the next one up here is actually pointing to those individual little ribosomes that are going to be used for making proteins. Some of them are floating free in the cytoplasm, and some of them are attached to the endoplasmic reticulum. Next, we are pointing at this little X-like structure that is in here. That is a chromosome. So this would be a cell that is getting ready to divide, whereas if this cell was in a relaxed state, these chromosomes would not be visible, and you would just have a tangled mess of DNA all inside this last structure, which is the nucleus. And you can see the nucleus is surrounded by this nuclear envelope, and there's the little pores in there and everything. So these are all of your different parts of the cell that you will be learning about more in class.